tentacles reach far back into the last century. But it wasn't until victories in Europe and Japan and the onset of the Cold War that political and economic conditions became perfect for actual execution. A conspiracy bigger and more secret than the Manhattan Project.
More odious and far-reaching.
No sooner had we defeated Germany than a new threat started appearing in skies over America. Drawn to Earth by the latest threat to extinction, the H-bomb. Explosions acting as transducers, drawing alien life forms through wormholes in spaceships using electrogravitic propulsion. Advanced extraterrestrial species visiting us, concerned for mankind and the threat of our self-destruction, forestalling our annihilation through their own self-sacrifice, and crashes at Roswell, more importantly, places like Aztec. World leaders signed secret memos directing scientific studies of alien technology and biochemistry. Classified studies were done at military installations S4, Groom Lake, Wright-Patterson, and Dulce. Extracting alien tissue. Tests were done on unsuspecting human subjects, and elaborately staged abductions in craft using alien technology recovered from the down saucers, including human hybridization through gene editing and forced implantation of alien embryos.
Why do such a thing and lie about it? Our own government.
Your own government lies as a matter of course, as a matter of policy. The Tuskegee experiments on black men in the 30s, Henrietta Lacks.
What are they trying to do?
That's the missing piece.
But it's not hard to imagine. A government hiding, hoarding alien technology for 70 years. At the expense of human life and the future of the planet. Driven not only by corporate greed, but a darker objective.
The takeover of America.
And then the world itself, by any means necessary, however violent, or cruel, or efficient.
An appropriate introduction for this week's show. After all, our astral guest is not only an expert on the X-Files, but has written a foundational book on the show. It truly is an oceanic pleasure to have back at the virtual Alexandria Chris Knowles, author of The Complete X-Files, The Secret History of Rock and Roll, and Our Gods Wear Spandex. Chris is also the driving force behind the Secret Sun blog, a chief source today for modern esoterica, alt history and politics, and conspiracy theory. It's certainly an essential resource for me.
Mulder, the truth is out there, but so are lies.
So welcome to Aeon by Gnostic Radio, always broadcast through the God Above God.com. We don't take prisoners but liberate them. We are not the final authority on anything, but hope to be an endless possibility for everything, including you finally finding the mystery that works for you and only you. You are the final authority and have always been. Thank you for being here in these inner sanctums of Gnosis, in the outer rectums of reality. And yes, I am Abraxas in his meat sack incarnation of Miguel Connor, podcasting in the lawful but frigid dystopia of Chicago. I am your Pompatus of Gnosis, that smell of colitas rising up through the air of a world gone mad. And you can leave as soon as you check out, anytime you please.
I didn't come here to tell you how this is going to end. I came here to tell you how it's going to begin.
This quote by April DeConnick puts our sacred and profane quest into perspective. It goes, Gnostics decided that the time had come to get some answers. Like Truman from the movie The Truman Show, the answers they sought could not be found within the chaos of their world. A universe that seemed constructed to deceive them at every turn. What they sought was reality behind the door in the sky, at the top of the celestial dome, beyond whatever cunning simulation this world might be. The quest for reality is the central feature of Gnostic spirituality. The Gnostics understand this quest to culminate in the direct knowledge of a supreme God who dwells outside the known universe. The god of their quest is a hidden, secret god, unknown to most people.
I am in a world of shit.
Again, it's awesome to have Chris Knowles back. He'll be making a puissant case that we are indeed living in Gnostic times. A Philip K. Dick world, if you would. I've made the argument many times before, but Chris will bring it to the Pleroma house in our spanning interview. What's more, as this is December, the year of our Demiurge 2017, Chris will grant a summary of this insane high weirdness 2017 and what's in store for 2018. The Archons have ramped up the illusion and delusion recently, a plan billions of years in the making to make sure Sophia's essence, your divine spark, stays buried once and for all in layers of conformity, amnesia, and mediocrity. But all learning is remembering, as Plato said, and we're all about the anamnesis, or loss of forgetfulness. It's up to us to push back against Jehovah and his angelic mafia. It's up to us to write our own gospel and live our own myth. As the Gnostics contended 2,000 years ago, the greatest conspiracy theory is reality itself. And the most relevant fake news is the false identity you bought into.
All I've ever known to be true is a lie.
The world has realized it and yelled about don't like it, rocked the Casbah and Kabbalah.
People should not be afraid of their governments. Governments should be afraid of their people.
It should be noted that Chris will talk a lot about magic, and it really all does come back to magic. But don't get caught up on a literalistic view of magic, but see it everywhere and know it's in the DNA of all reality and perspective, from praying to advertising. To assist, let me quote from the magician Alan Moore himself. I believe that magic is art, and that art, whether that be music, writing, sculpture, or any other form, is literally magic. Art is, like magic, the science of manipulating symbols, words, or images to achieve changes in consciousness. Indeed, to cast a spell is simply to spell, to manipulate words, to change people's consciousness. And this is why I believe that an artist or writer is the closest thing in the contemporary world to a shaman.
Your own father said that artists use lies to tell the truth.
As you can see, the elite are using magic, in more ways than one, on us for a long time. We need to find our own magic and set our divine spark free. Living a magical, symbolical, and creative life is just turning the tables on Jehovah and his butt slaves in the establishment. We must create better than the creator gods to calibrate our minds to the mind of the alien god. You have been warned, and I hope you true seeker warriors have found as much magic as possible at Aeon by Gnostic Radio.
If we live our lives the right way, then every single thing we do becomes a work of art.
Thanks for being here. Thanks for those of you who support on a weekly basis. And thanks for waking up, or else you wouldn't have materialized at the virtual Alexandria. It's no accident. It is magic.
There are no coincidences, Delia. Only the illusion of coincidence.
Get ready for the first part of Chris's Gnosis pregnant interview. And members and patrons, get ready for a full interview where Chris really reveals the answers to becoming free from the Black Iron prison. There were a few Skype burps here and there, but all in all it came out really nice-like. That seems to be the pattern Chris has encountered recently in interviews. So it usually means the Archons know there is something to his research. Let us truly end with a quote from Knowles himself. A warning and an opportunity as we go deeper down the rabbit hole of the Kenoma. It goes, Gnosticism is an outsider proposition, an introvert's game. The truth doesn't always set you free. Sometimes it saddles you with a burden you can never escape. So choose very carefully where you decide to start digging and what dragons you choose to slay. Prepare to be taken places you never wanted to go. Gnosis isn't always a flower. Sometimes it's a sword. Maybe more often than not.
The takeover of America.
And then the world itself, by any means necessary, however violent, or cruel, or efficient. By severe drought, brought on by weather wars, conducted secretly using aerial contaminants and high-altitude electromagnetic waves, in a state of perpetual war, to create problem, reaction, solution scenarios to distract, enrage, and enslave American citizens at home, with tools like the Patriot Act and the National Defense Authorization Act, which abridge the Constitution in the name of national security. The militarization of police forces in cities across the U.S., the building of prison camps by the Federal Emergency Management Agency with no stated purpose, the corporate takeover of food and agriculture, pharmaceuticals and healthcare, even the military in clandestine agendas to fatten, dull, sicken, and control a populace already consumed by consumerism.
And I encourage you all to go shopping more.
A government that taps your phone, collects your data, and monitors your whereabouts with impunity. A government preparing to use that data against you when it strikes. And the final takeover begins.
The takeover of America.
By a well-oiled and well-armed multinational group of elites that will cull, kill, and subjugate.
Happening as we sit here.
It's happening all around us.
The other shoe waiting to drop.
It'll probably start on a Friday.
This is the AM Byte interview, and with us, we definitely have the pleasure of being joined by Christopher Knowles to discuss, well, a lot of high weirdness, and it's overdue. How you doing today, Chris?
I'm doing great, Miguel.
Glad to have you on. And
glad to be here.
It's always great to have you. And again, it is overdue because throughout the last couple of years since you were last on, I kept saying, okay, Chris is on, he's on the roll. He's got these great, powerful ideas. And at some point, there's going to be a pause and we're going to get a break, or the stuff going around in the world is going to stop. We'll go through sort of a boring Obama period or something like that. But it just hasn't happened. Do you feel it's just really frenetic lately with you?
Yeah, it's accelerating. You know, and the work I do on the blog is always sort of reactive. You know, I'm always just reacting to the things that are in the environment. And there's just been so much going on, particularly in the past couple of months, that you know, I don't know where to you know, to cut it off, you know, because it's like I'm constantly in reaction to what's going on. And a lot of people are like, you know, Chris, you're kind of like burning it up lately. And I'm like, you know, sort of like, why don't you mellow it out a bit so we can catch our breaths here?
Exactly.
And it's like, you know, my reaction is, well, you know, tell whoever is, you know, orchestrating, tell whichever Archons are orchestrating all this, you know, symbolism that's being thrown at us constantly in the news feed to slow down, you know. And like I said, I mean, it's like I'm reacting to what's in the environment, and it seems to me like very reminiscent of Obama's first year, when there was just all this symbolism being welled up, and, you know, he was really playing into this quite consciously. I mean, you know, visiting the pyramids and touring in front of the Temple of Hercules, where he gave a very pivotal speech in his campaign. You know, so he was definitely cognizant of this stuff, and he was definitely playing up to it. And is it something that you see just in like a president's first year? I don't know, but it's been really overwhelming in many ways.
I think it's before that, Chris, because, for example, I've been reading The Secret Sun since like 2010, and I always enjoyed it, got a lot from it. And then you took a break. And even on Facebook, we started going to the Lunar Barbecue for our high weirdness and other esoterica. And then you jumped back in. And for some reason, I thought it was because of the death of Bowie, the imminent return of the X-Files, and all this really other important cultural stuff. But you really rebooted, and that's something you told Gordon and me when we were interviewed. You really rebooted all the way back to, I'm looking at it here, July 21st, 2014. And you actually started with These Are Gnostic Times. What was going on then that you felt you had to get back into it?
Well, it's hard to say exactly. I'm trying to like rewind back to that period, but the Gnostic Times post that I used to relaunch the blog, full time, was really inspired by observation, by seeing what had once been very esoteric and underground and maybe even a touch elitist being played out all around us. That it seemed to me that the Gnostic view of reality, after 2,000 years of trying, had really settled in and taken root in a culture. And, there are a number of different reasons for this that we can go into. But I really saw that ideas that I had been exploring more than 20 years prior to that post were really starting to flower. And, for better or worse, it's a mixed bag, but definitely seeing a Gnostic view of reality become increasingly mainstream.
I guess tell the listener, what would you mean by a Gnostic view of reality?
The view that we are living in an imperfect simulation, so to speak, that this is not the real world that we live in. We're living in a kind of simulacrum. We're living in a world that is inherently false, that is inherently manipulative, and is inherently controlled by unseen forces that orchestrate a number of different kind of hoaxes that are meant to steer our consciousness in a certain way. And, you can quibble of, which exact school of ancient Gnosticism this is kind of deriving from. But, of course, we had the Matrix, which was sort of like the grand debut. It was like the big rollout of explicitly Gnostic worldview, and that was 1999. So 15 years later, I really saw those seeds start to germinate and take root, and I think it has a lot to do with the people who were most impressionable at the age, at the time when the Matrix was released, but also the internet, computer graphics, gaming has a lot to do with this. You're talking about a generation that has no fixed sense of structure, of any fixed sense of what is real and what is CGI. What is reality and what is simulation of reality. And I think that when you immerse yourselves in CGI films and in computer graphics and games, it changes the way you operate necessarily in meat space. So in other words, you're immersed in these practically virtual reality environments. For all intents and purposes, these are virtual environments. When you step outside into the world outside the game, it can't help but influence the way you see reality. I'll give you an example, and this is 40 years old now, but I remember seeing the film, the remake of Invasion of the Body Snatchers with Donald Sutherland and Leonard Nimoy. Yeah, and it scared the hell out of me. It was a terrifying film, and it had that incredibly downbeat ending. And when I stepped outside the theater, I didn't know who, I was still in that reality. I was 12 years old at the time, so you're incredibly impressionable, and things affect you in ways that don't necessarily affect people even 3 or 4 years older. So I'm still in that reality. I'm still immersed in that reality. And I'm looking at people around me and thinking, are these real people, or are these, pod people? Is this real? Because I was so immersed in that reality. I was so drawn into it. It played so powerfully on my emotions that it affected the way I saw the world outside the theater. And another example, another cinema example, since cinema was our virtual reality for, better part of a century. I remember going to see kung fu movies in Boston in the combat zone on Saturday mornings. And, you'd step outside the theater and there'd be all these like kids like fighting, acting out these stories that they saw on screen. A lot of times it was just mock fighting, but you saw this. That reality that these young kids were so immersed in influenced the way they responded in the real world. So I think this whole sense of simulation, of computer graphics, of the media itself being a simulation of reality that is processed and packaged through certain people with certain ideas and certain ways of seeing the world and certain, agendas that they want people to follow. I mean, this is almost universal. I don't think there's any kind of, effective media that is not trying to sell you a worldview. So younger kids, people, millennials, let's say, and even sort of the tail end of Generation X grew up with a much different sense of what is real and what is simulation than you or I did, so to the early Gen Xers and certainly the baby boomers, that everything became provisional, everything became temporary, everything, that you had these realities, say the film, the James Cameron film, why am I blanking out on the name? Avatar. Yeah. So there was this whole phenomenon with that film that people were experiencing like withdrawal and depression because the world, with the 3D glasses and the IMAX was so seductive and so immersive that they had a difficult time adjusting to the fact that, the real world is actually nothing like that. And, this need for the world to be like that. So I think it's a paradox, really. It's an amazing paradox because you think of Gnosticism and you think of the Gnostic worldview, and it's based in, it's based in an ancient, the Roman Empire, pre-technical, pre-mechanic, pre-industrial worldview, but for some strange reason, all this, super high technology is somehow restoring that. And it's the kind of thing that you could write volumes about, why exactly is this happening? But I think the strongest analogy that we can draw here is that the Roman Empire was such a destabilizing force and such a disruptive force to traditional societies. The way traditional societies had lived their lives, the way they saw the entire universe. I mean, their entire worldview was perhaps, not based on anything outside their village or their section of a city that they lived in. And then comes this force from absolutely nowhere with, what seemed like super high technology. I mean, they did have war engines and things like that, but just the way they organized themselves and the way they fought, your reality paradigm was upended. So I think the way that the power of the Roman Empire and its reach and its sort of totalizing effect is somehow being replicated by this new empire, the empire of, digital technology, of computer graphics, of simulated reality, of augmented reality, on and on and on, that these things are having the same disruptive and destabilizing effect that empires once had. So we had spoken a number of years ago, I guess now, and I sort of made the analogy that the Gnostics were kind of like writing fanfic, They were writing, not necessarily Slashborn, but they were writing their own versions of the gospel stories and the stories of the apostles. It very much felt like fanfic, and of course the argument can be made that it's all fanfic, to begin with. But I was kind of thinking about this, and I was thinking about fandom and how fandom really has evolved as a religion today. Certainly doesn't recognize itself as such yet, and I'll emphasize the yet there. But I was thinking about fandom, and then I was thinking about how all these cults and groups, particularly these more esoteric mystery groups and some of the Gnostic groups, were very, very much reminded me of fandom, particular fandoms, and they sort of operate as such. And the interesting thing with Gnosticism, and bringing this up today, is that so I feel very much that Gnosticism is going mainstream, and it may not necessarily identify itself as such, and there are certain people who are Gnostic to the bone and may not identify themselves as such. And also how Gnosticism itself, formalized Gnosticism, seems to be, in some senses, waning. But it reminds me, and this is another fandom analogy, is that since organized religion itself is being eclipsed, is waning, that Gnosticism operates kind of like the way indie publishers do, that they, their stock rises when the mainstream rises, and it ebbs and flows with the fortunes of the mainstream. But in the same regard, I mean, it's like, so the story now is that comic book sales are on the decline again. That comics proper, the market is sort of tail spinning, as far as sales go. But superheroes have never been more prevalent than they are now. I mean, superhero entertainment is mainstream entertainment now. It's probably the only thing that we could even recognize as mainstream entertainment now, and not some sort of niche. The only films that actually make money for the studios. So in this regard, Gnosticism and Gnostic principles are becoming mainstream and popularized at the same point in time that say Gnostic practice or Gnostic study or formalized Gnosticism, like the Gnostic Catholic Church and things like that. I mean, which, we can argue about whether that's, completely heretical.
Right.
But that at the same time, the form of Gnosticism seems to be waning. I believe that the actual practice of Gnosticism is growing and becoming mainstream, and that it very well may become the mainstream default position for spirituality. And I think what will happen is that once it disseminates, once it becomes accepted, once its principles become accepted, then you will see the form reemerge. That the form, the study of say the Nag Hammadi texts, or even the Mandean texts, or whichever you want to choose. That once the praxis becomes normalized, that the form will revive and perhaps even eclipse the mainstream religions as we understand them today. And I realize that's a really bold statement, and it may seem just absurd to some people, but much stranger things have happened. I mean, nobody in the first century could have ever predicted the establishment of Christianity as the state cult of Rome. It just would have been absolutely inconceivable. Probably wouldn't been inconceivable during the Diocletian oppressions. So stranger things have happened, and it wouldn't surprise me to see Gnosticism when it completes this kind of subterranean infiltration of the culture, to reemerge, or perhaps maybe for the first time to emerge as a form, as a as a recognized religious system.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I can almost see that trajectory, but wouldn't the argument be that you said earlier, Christianity was the social justice of those times, and it got weaponized for the powers that be? Isn't that what we're going to see again? They'll just weaponize Gnosticism, create another Scientology or something like that?
That certainly is the danger. And again, it's the kind of thing where, just to draw another pop culture analogy, I mean, I remember the early days of the hardcore scene in Boston, and it was pretty rough and tumble. But if you fell, somebody would pick you up, and there's this sort of this brotherhood mentality at work. Not long after, when it went from like these lofts and basements to the main, the mainstream clubs in New York. It's when the idiots started showing up, the Nazis and the jocks and the troublemakers. I mean, the people who are just there to hurt people. So, yeah, I mean, things do become weaponized. It's almost an inevitability in some cases, but not always. And there may not be the same impetus to weaponize Gnosticism the way Christianity was weaponized to unify an empire. I mean, let's not forget why Christianity was in fact weaponized, because Christianity, as it came to be established in Rome, was really a collage. It was sort of a mishmash of Christianity and sun worship and mystery cult. It was really, I think, quite consciously cobbled together to please as many power structures and interest groups, as possible, while establishing itself as a unifying force. I mean, the empire was really kind of falling apart, and it did schism, eventually, and of course Constantine really started to emphasize the Eastern Empire, as the Western Empire had all the problems with the Goths and all those people. So there is a danger that it could be weaponized, but I don't think it's in fact inevitable. I mean, superheroes. I mean, you could argue that they're being weaponized in order to sell people on transgenics and sell people on transhumanism and AI and all these kind of things. But, I mean, you could make that argument, but I think that most people wouldn't see that per se. I mean, they would just basically see it as entertainment. I don't think we've seen the de facto weaponization of superheroes, certainly not like the way they were weaponized during World War II. So I don't think it's necessarily inevitable. It could be, become the counterculture. It could become, a mainstream counterculture, the way rock culture was mainstreamed, in the late 60s and early 70s. So, I mean, the jury's still out, and you never know. But I don't think it's an inevitability. No.
Yeah, good point. Because I think the church fathers talked about how the Gnostics would go to their lodges and dress up with animal masks and do all these rituals, mimicking the stars, the movement of the stars, and all that. They were just basically becoming gods. And today we've got the other mystery religion, which is the cosplay, the Comic-Cons, and I don't think it's hard to touch that kind of vibe, don't you think, Chris? I mean, this is sacred for these people. There's this energy and communion and everything with these people dressing up.
Oh yeah, and believe me, there have been like comic creators and stuff and retailers who complain about the cosplayers at conventions blocking the aisles and blocking their tables and yeah. And woe betide them. Woe betide the one who speaks up, because the wrath of the gods comes down on their heads pretty quickly. It's interesting because a lot of people who look back on Gnosticism and Christianity and the mystery cults, they don't understand how the ancient world perceived, religion and the gods and the role of religion. That this was culture. I mean, this was pop culture. I mean, religion was pop culture, and it just depended on which variety of religion you chose to adhere to. But these were basically fandoms, for lack of a better word. And, Kat Ironwood told me something really interesting. I mean, she said that, and I guess some people would maybe argue with her, but she said that, you never would have seen neo-paganism without science fiction fandom and fantasy fandom, probably more specifically, but that neo-paganism is an outgrowth of fandom. And kind of behaved like a fandom, kind of behaved like a LARP,
That makes sense. The mystery religions of our times.
Yeah, I mean, I think that neo-paganism in that expression, that expression that, that did arise from convention culture and Renaissance fair culture. I mean, I think that's definitely on the wane. I think it was very much a generational expression, sort of late boomers and Gen Xers. I don't think that millennials are particularly interested in that kind of neo-paganism, because I think that neo-paganism was it was kind of a LARP that was meant to act as a surrogate for church, and kids who aren't raised in any kind of religious upbringing and have no religious training, they don't really respond to that.
I guess the question is, where does this lead? Because I agree, it's great that in a way we become very distrustful of reality. I know Generation X, and before that we're always like, stick it to the man and all that. But at the end of the day, we had jobs and all that stuff. We wanted to keep the peace. Now it seems nobody trusts reality. Hey, I don't like a round earth. I'm going for a flat earth. I don't think Australia exists. I can embrace whatever conspiracy theory I want because it just empowers me. Do you see a danger in this, or how do we navigate? How do we find the right gnosis?
Oh, I think it's tremendously dangerous. Mm-hmm. I think it's incredibly unstable and combustive in a way. I absolutely see tremendous danger in this, but I think that it's systemic. I think it's everyone has the power to immerse themselves in their own realities, in their own reality simulation now. Everyone can only read the media that they feel validates their worldview. Everyone can associate with people that only agree with them and reinforce that worldview. So I think that it's a systemic and culture-wide phenomenon that we're looking here, that consensus. Now, the interesting thing about consensus is that consensus always involves compromise. When you come to a consensus, you negotiate. You have certain things that you want to establish and hold on to, but there are certain things that you can negotiate and agree to disagree on or agree to give up in some ways. And reality as we've known it, particularly since the Industrial Revolution, has required deeply held beliefs and very identity. I mean, look at the whole idea of the melting pot, the American melting pot, a metaphor that comes directly from, industrial society, from industrial culture. But, to work in the factory, to cooperate in the factory required you to leave everything outside that marked who you were as a person and surrender yourself to a reality paradigm that the paymasters were offering. And, the great example of, the British Empire and the Royal Society sort of dictating this Darwinian, reductionist, mechanistic view of reality that so many people find lacking at best, but became, and is in many quarters is still mandatory. That you have to attest to this. You have to bear witness to this this worldview and this paradigm, even if you find it just absolutely ludicrous or offensive. So the society as we've known it, you can't separate the reality of the factory, of industrial economy, of war, the machinery of war. I mean, the military being the great equalizer, the military being the great reduction that to the mean, the reduction to the mean, to the lowest common denominator, so to speak. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people in the military would quibble with that, understand why, but it's you on the uniform. It's uniformity. It's you surrender to a collective identity, a uniformity, and you have to hold that up. In many ways, this period now is it's a step on our Starfleet reality, and Star Trek being not just a pop culture phenomenon, but to me part of a social engineering program run out of the Office of Naval Intelligence. And, that's certainly talked about all the time. If you sort of draw the roots to where all that is coming from, it's entirely military. So I think that what we are going to see is that we're going to see this instability that is arising from people having the ability to define their own worldviews and reinforce that through media, through selective media, through curated media, lead to either a genuine or a manufactured crisis of sorts that will be resolved through, again, what I call the Starfleet reality, where uniformity and conformity and order is imposed from above, but is sweetened. There's a spoonful of sugar to help the medicine go down, and that will be this greater goal, this greater goal that we all need to unify around. And I think that it's probably closer than we know. The way things are rolling out with AI and robotics and the space programs, I think that we're probably I think we will see this within our lifetime. I think we will see what I call the Starfleet reality imposed from above in our lifetime. But in between might be, a greater and more traumatic period of chaos and conflict.
Yeah, I would certainly have to agree, but I guess that would be the question. You say from above, and it seems I don't know how to explain this, but it seems in a lot of conspiracy circles, especially of all places and more of the right, there's more of an atheistic sensibility. I mean, when I try to explain to people, this is spiritual wickedness in high places, as above, so below. You can't stop at the humans. There are forces greater, again, from above. Would you agree with that one, or what do you tell people?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Well, I always tell people that, and a lot of them will just dismiss me out of hand. And what are you going to do? But yeah, I absolutely believe that. And you can't. The social conditioning that we receive basically from birth, and particularly now with the Millennial Generation, which I used to call the daycare generation, because this is the generation that's been involved in socialized daycare since birth, essentially. It's very hard to argue with the power of, the consensus makers. And part of that consensus is that, religion is just sort of like, it's almost like a form of therapy. It's kind of like, OCD rituals that make you feel better. And that's basically the best place that they have for it. That is essentially othered, in our culture. And you see this throughout. If you look for it, you see it everywhere. So it's kind of paradoxical in the sense that, there are a lot of people, it's what I call the anti-Gnostic hyper-Gnostics, that their worldview is essentially Gnostic, that reality is essentially a hoax, that we are being constantly lied to, that we are constantly being conditioned to accept a worldview that comes from above, and you and I would see that as essentially archonic in nature.
Right.
There are a series of emanations. It's sort of like the chain of command. The chain of command is the emanations from the Archons. So you and I would see that, certainly. And I think that there are a lot of people that are kind of waking up to, I'm starting to see the term Archon thrown around in places that I wouldn't usually expect it to see it thrown around. So, it's something where it takes time to sink in. And like I said, we're seeing, this flowering of Gnostic thinking, even though it's not necessarily sectarian Gnostic, and it may not be, this is a raging contradiction, but Orthodox Gnostic.
Right.
Its worldview is informed by Gnosticism. And I think it has a lot to do with the fact that we are seeing, kind of what I call a restoration. We're in what is essentially a restoration period where you had, drawing back to the Magna Carta, you had this idea that people had rights, that people were sovereign, that people had value, individuals had value. And this was a very powerful, motivating force in Western culture, certainly. But what it really draws from, and what it really is based in, is the fact that, the plagues, the Black Plague and the bubonic plague and all these pandemics that basically wiped all the, craftspeople and tradesmen and people in guilds, out with all the rest of society. It was supply and demand, that labor became valuable, that labor became a commodity. Now, what we are seeing now with the rise of AI and robotics and globalization is the constant devaluing of labor and the constant devaluing of human capital. So human capital is becoming increasingly devalued. And once the robotics, I'm a bit skeptical about how pervasive and extensive robotics and AI will be, and whether or not it will actually live up to a lot of the hype that we're seeing. I'm always skeptical, and it pays to be skeptical in these cases. But I can't argue with the fact that consolidation, corporate consolidation, redundancy, globalization, insourcing, outsourcing, offshoring, inshoring, all these strategies that the economic powers have perfected are cutting into the idea of not only the value of human capital, but also the notion itself of sovereignty, of individuality. So everything is increasingly becoming collectivized. And it reminds me very much of Rollerball, where the original Rollerball, not the horrible remake.
Yes.
But this great scene with John Houseman, and he's there's this whole discussion of like this ludicrous game, this absurd game that nobody can actually win, and he states quite openly that the idea of Rollerball is to demonstrate, quite compellingly, the futility of individual effort and effort outside the corporate state. And this is that period in Hollywood in the 70s when we saw so many great revelations of the nature of reality. And unfortunately, the people who wrote these films meant them to be, cautionary tales that would, steer us away from these powers that they saw looming on the horizon. But unfortunately, they ended up just becoming prophecies. They became maybe self-fulfilling prophecies in that way. So I think that it is tantamount in many ways to the social economic conditions of that, the first century of the Roman era, when Rome is globalism. Rome is the globalizing force. Rome is moving masses of people to and fro, according to their economic and industrial needs. And, sometime later we start to see, disease following these roots of trade and roots of movements of peoples. So in many, many ways, I mean, it's like, Philip K. Dick, the great Gnostic of our times, said the empire, never ended. And it just seemed to maybe hibernate and regroup and plan out its strategies for the world that we're seeing, unfold around us now. And what I see, and what I saw, to be honest with you, what I saw that the seeds of 30 years ago is, very much the people that are valued, that are valued workers, that cannot be automated or robotized, will basically operate in a feudal system, and in a feudal environment. And it's interesting that William Gibson, who seems, he's not necessarily identified as a Gnostic, but I see him in many ways as the inheritor of the Philip K. Dick mantle. And he sort of saw this, where your loyalties are with, your employer, the corporate overlords. And ironically, what this really is it's high technology, super high technology, restoring the very same systems that we saw operate in ancient Sumer. And ancient Sumer is, that you had temples that were operating plantations. You had temples that were operating brick making factories. You had temples that were operating, weaving and cloth making. And that everyone who worked in these trades, was ultimately beholden to the power of the temple. And I think that we're sort of seeing, with the rise of these, I mean, you can't even call them, transnational mega corporations anymore. They are like deities now, Amazon and Apple and Google and, these various conglomerations that are you can't even recognize them in the model of, the conglomerating corporation of, say, 40 years ago. I mean, we don't really have historical context for these things other than to trace them back to, like I said, this economic system, this feudalistic system in ancient Sumer.
I like how you say feudalistic, because when people ask me, and I'm no expert, but how times are so complicated, I mean, you don't know when the facts start or end. I always tell people, look at the Odyssey. Why did Zeus, in one of the tales is, why did Zeus start the war, the Trojan War? Because he felt that the human population had grown too much and he wanted to whittle it down to something more manageable. So I always tell people, it's the same story. It really is a story about eugenics, about keeping us at a manageable level, keeping us at an easy level to control, while the few take all the power and resources. Do you think I'm off with that, Chris, or do you think that's basically me, old boss history, regardless of the backdrop and the scenario? Zeus is always working for that goal.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I mean, and the problem is that so many of us still want to cling on to these civic myths, that are really a lot younger and a lot shorter lived than we would ever want to acknowledge. But, the myth of, citizenship, the myth of individual sovereignty, the myth of culture, of society itself, that what we have seen throughout history is a number of variant and unfriendly, mutually hostile cultures, coexisting under the aegis of a totalizing state. So we can look at, the 20th century as being, the great period of collective culture. We had Hollywood, and we had television, and we had fast food, McDonald's and Burger King, and we had, pop music and jazz and swing and rock and roll and, hip hop. We had all these cultural forces that became so powerful and so compelling that they were exported to the rest of the world. And, the rest of the world ate this stuff up. All these myths that we grew up with of, Russian teens, bartering for a real pair of Levi's or for a Beatles record or something. That this great myth that our culture, specifically maybe our Anglo-American culture, was so compelling and so totalizing that it was it was like a tsunami that overtook the world. And I think that was essentially true. But it was also based in the power of electric-based media, pre-electronic based media. The electronic-based media changes the entire equation. But the power. I always see, say, the rise of fascism as it was kind of like traditionalism's use of the PA system. That these leaders, Mussolini and Hitler and so on, the public address system turned them into gods. This godlike voice that just was coming from everywhere. It wasn't this barely heard screed coming from some balcony and some portico. It was the voice of God. And, the power of, Leni Riefenstahl and her use of cinema. And, let's not forget that we had a kind of totalizing, federalizing force in America as well with the New Deal that also made use of these technologies. So, the West kind of had almost a monopoly on the technology. And certainly a monopoly on the high end of that technology for much of the 20th century. But the 21st century is the electronic. It's the general becomes the local. Things change. Things spread out. People diffuse from the norm, and I think that this is the way Gnosticism spreads and grows, because you see worldviews as inherently provisional and inherently negotiable, but at the same time, power wants you to believe that reality is fixed and reality is constant. But you yourself have the wherewithal and the access to information to understand that it is in fact, reality is an illusion. We all agree to recognize it. That you see the world. When you have access to the internet and you have access to all these different streams of information and streams of information that dissent from consensus, it's going to create. I think it creates kind of a dissonance, a cognitive dissonance, and maybe even like a spiritual dissonance, in that sense that, mommy and daddy are not going to protect you anymore, that you're in a big bad world where there aren't, the rules of engagement are arbitrary. The rules of engagement are constantly subject to change. And you can argue that, again, getting back to this theme, where this is kind of the reality of the rise of Roman imperialism and the subjugation of peoples who had seen themselves as, the beloved of the gods. And, I want to bring this forward a bit and draw like how I see this Gnosticism arising. But, I'm just, to round this up, I'm sort of I might be repeating myself here, but this is how I see Gnosticism reborn. But I just want to back this up, because I know you and I have discussed in the past, who were the original Gnostics? How did this arise? What was the impetus behind this break with traditional religion? And I think what I know certain scholars, who are much more well versed in this topic than I am will disagree, but I see the Gnostics as disaffected first generation, maybe second generation Christians who were waiting for the kingdom of heaven to descend, for Jesus to return and the kingdom of heaven to be established, and just got tired of waiting. They got tired of waiting for this very austere and literalist worldview that Paul preached, that you needed to sacrifice so much because the kingdom of heaven was at hand. I mean, it was at hand. How many times have we heard that expression, particularly if you had a religious upbringing? Yeah, I mean, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. I think maybe towards the end of the first century, they just started to realize that it wasn't at hand, that it wasn't imminent, that maybe we had to sort of reinterpret this. We had to see these teachings more metaphorically, more symbolically, more spiritually than sort of as this call to arms, sort of as this rallying cry, to raise an army for this kingdom. So I see very, very much that the original Gnostics, in my view at least, were disaffected and discouraged and disappointed warriors, so to speak. The thing I always like to point out is that, Christians were really the first social justice warriors. I mean, Christianity was it was a social protest movement. Everything is couched in the understanding of religion at that point in time. But, the Roman Empire was a horror show. It was, Rome itself was an open sewer. You had, this hereditary class that were all driven insane by venereal disease and inbreeding. It was all built on the backs of slaves. It's horrible. I mean, I think a lot of people tend to overlook that because they see Christianity through this lens of, I don't know, like Westboro Baptist Church or something, and they don't understand, the worldview and the understanding that the Christian had in its inception. So, the one thing that I've seen, now I grew up Methodist, and it was a traditional Methodist church. It was, it was very conservative. I mean, it wasn't conservative religious as we understand that phrase today, but it was conservative. It was family oriented. It was very traditional, very had that understanding of the world that was really being whittled away very quickly. I mean, it was kind of almost a 19th century view of society and the world, but it was, I loved it. It was very warm and welcoming place, and very, you became just part of a much larger family. But we started to see sometime in around 78, 79, we started to get a lot of these tracts, these evangelical tracts, fundamentalist tracts. They'd come in these big boxes or these big packets, these sort of shrink wrapped packets. And the pastor at the church, very traditional conservative Methodist from Kentucky. I mean, he didn't want anything to do with it because, he saw, and this is in hindsight that I recognize this, but I believe that he saw that this was a contagion. This was a virus. This was something that was going to cause, the churches he saw great harm. But so much a part of this world, and you saw on like, say, the 700 Club or, Jerry Falwell or Jimmy Swaggart, was this idea that it was all leading towards this big showdown in the desert, the showdown between the forces of good and the forces of evil. And this was imminent. Again, the kingdom of heaven was at hand again. And that Armageddon, as distinct in this way from the apocalypse, was upon us. That, the battle of Armageddon was coming, and we needed to prepare ourselves. We needed to militarize ourselves in order to fight this battle. And they were able to sort of kick the can down the road for a number of years. And I think the culture war played into this, obviously pretty heavily. But it sort of got to the point that they had to, put up or shut up. And I believe this is kind of the impetus behind, Desert Storm and then later Desert Shield, the Iraq War, that the people who are running this, the intelligence agencies and industrialists that were running this program, this fundamentalist program, kind of like they needed to put up or shut up. And I think they sort of threw a Hail Mary pass in a way with the way the Iraq wars were executed and conducted. So I believe that they kind of felt that there was all this fervor, and it was starting to wane. It was starting to splinter. They needed to produce, and they needed to deliver Armageddon. And so we had Armageddon. We had American troops, occupying Babylon itself.
Oh yeah.
What better Book of Revelation LARP could you ask for? Yeah. It was like, the LARP. But it all just kind of went sideways. It all just fell apart. It all just kind of dissipated, and we started to see, Abu Ghraib and various horrible massacres of unarmed citizens and things like that. And, we saw the rise of all these private armies, these mercenary armies that are more and more part of the vanguard of the military-industrial complex. So, people saw these things and saw how it just wasn't going according to plan. And perhaps you could argue that it was orchestrated, or perhaps you could argue that people like Rumsfeld and Cheney were sort of outfoxed by this whole insurrectional model that the Iraqi army seemed to follow. But it all just went badly. And I think that you started to see when around the time I started the blog, and this is in the aftermath. The invasion is in 2003, so I started the blog in 2007. It's 4 years later, and people are starting to really wake up to the fact that this is not going to work out the way they had planned. And we started to see people drift away, even from the conservative evangelical churches, which were the only churches that were in fact sustaining themselves throughout, this wake of the 60s that really decimated the mainline churches and decimated the Roman Catholic Church. So, we had our Armageddon, and it just ended up in, a quagmire, and, our best and brightest coming home with half their faces blown off and things like that. It was just a horror show, and you had no right to expect that it was going to be otherwise. But I think in that, what the Obama people were really very canny in doing, and I think that this use of symbolism, Egyptian symbolism and Masonic symbolism, they were very canny in doing, is offering sanctuary, offering sort of a chill out room, so to speak, for all these people who were disaffected Christian evangelicals and millennialists and dispensationalists and so on, because you started to see so often, and I see this so often today. The tenor on the left changing, quite dramatically from what I had been used to growing up, to sounding a lot more like the tenor that on the right, particularly in the 90s. So it's a shift, because so many people who are disappointed millenarians started to were seduced by this whole idea of progress, this idea of progressivism and progress. So that's where we start to see, this very aggressive and totalizing view of progress. And I think a lot of that is being fueled by this influx of people from the right, particularly the way that the right had become so incredibly toxic during the Clinton years, just poisonous. And I have to say, I have to confess that, in the 90s, I sort of, drifted back to the church, and I was kind of exploring that again and trying to find a home in the church again. But I'd go online on America Online and just see these poisonous, horrific screeds by these fundamentalists. And, not only that, but just this overall tenor, among the Christian community in the 90s that was just so, it was offensive. It was off-putting. And I don't think I'm any way alone in that. So I think that is also driving the Gnosticism. And, you see a lot of people who sort of follow the Vogelin model, the Vogelin model of, Marxism being a form of Gnosticism. I mean, all these ludicrous kind of claims that,
Hitler was a Gnostic, yes.
Yeah. Polemic. And you see so much of this on the right today. You see so much of this. I mean, even somebody who comes across as being, more intellectual and more sober, Rod Dreher on the American Conservative site, and it's also a magazine. I mean, he's also playing up this whole idea of the left being Gnostic, social justice warriors, postmodernists being Gnostic, and you can kind of argue that they're Gnostic in the sense that they don't adhere to received tradition in that regard. But I mean, what else can you point to in their worldview that is Gnostic? And I think that this whole idea that utopianism is somehow inherently Gnostic, and I think if you really look at Gnosticism, I think Gnostics are inherently suspicious of utopianism. You know what I'm saying? I think I don't think you can really make this argument that utopianism
is yes against it. Yeah,
I think what we're seeing is progressivism as it's understood today is really following on this line of dispensationalism, that there are a series of steps that you take towards perfection, towards the perfected society, the kingdom of heaven, so to speak, or the workers' paradise, however you want to put it. And I'm not the first person to make this argument. I think a lot of people in the past have looked to Marxism and fascism and all these different isms and emanations as being essentially a kind of misguided or missteered form of dispensationalism, of millennialism, of eschatology. So in this regard, I mean, it's like, so we have all these things, all these upheavals and dislocations and disruptions to, even this very newly minted reality paradigm that you can kind of maybe trace back to the 1920s, the rise of mass media, the rise of, electrification, the rise of a sort of a form of industrialism that was offered more prosperity to workers than certainly had been the case for the past, however, couple of hundred years that industrialism had risen. So even this very newly minted, this very fresh, this very cobbled together reality paradigm that you can really trace back to the 1920s is being chipped away at, and certainly being chipped away at by post-structuralists and postmodernists in academia, where everything has to be, attacked, everything has to be dismantled, everything has to be disassembled. It's almost like this little race, who can be the most, deconstructionalist, and, is toothpaste racist, things like that. I mean, all these kind of ideas that have really taken root in in academia are not Gnostic to me. They're millennialists. They're which is based in this whole idea of eschatology and kingdom of heaven. Gnostic type of Gnosticism is sort of analogous to Manichaeism. Who's Mani? Mani is sort of the guy who rises, Persian environment, Zoroastrian, Mesopotamian, a lot of history there, a lot of heavy weight of the past in this worldview. And when did Mani hit the scene? Mani hits the scene when all the, what's called the Syrian Egyptian school of Gnosticism is really starting to wane. It's really starting to taper off. That initial burst that we see in like the, say the first half of the 2nd century, which is sort of the golden age of Gnosticism, is starting to dissipate. And Mani comes around with this very severe dualistic form of Gnosticism, where the dualism that's inherent in Gnosticism is weaponized. It's purified. It's distilled. And it's distilled into this worldview of us versus them. You're either with us or against us. The world is inherently evil, and you need to become like those Roman centurions in the service of God to cope with this. And I think that that kind of that vestigial fundamentalism that we see in these Gnostics who don't realize they're Gnostics is very much analogous to that. It's very much analogous to this severe, embattled sense that I think Mani held and preached.
Yeah, that's well said. I'd like to bounce an idea for you because what you said gave me a lot to think of, and this is sort of I'm at the early stages of this, but I think you're right about the idea of disillusioned Gnostics. And looking at the Gnostic writings, it sort of starts with the Gospel of Thomas and the Valentinians, 1st century, and they're like just nice Christians, and we'll make the best of it, and the world's of an illusion. But as the older texts come out, you start reading texts like the Apocalypse of Peter, the Gospel of Judas, and as you said, you see not just a disillusion, but an anger, they're really pissed off at the way society is, at the whole universe, and they're angry at other Gnostics, they're angry at Christians, they're angry at everybody. Then as you get to the 3rd and 4th century, they're no longer really, they're basically practicing some serious magic. I mean, Plotinus and Porphyry are complaining that they're out there in the different heavens and they are summoning angels and they're doing all this powerful magic. And of course, we see that with the Mandeans in the early times. I mean, they are really going at war. Like you said, they're warriors. They're going out there and they're commanding angels. They're changing the dimensions and they're pissing people off. I always thought, well, maybe that's the real reason why the Gnostics had to go, because they were tapping into forces that humans shouldn't know. And maybe that's the reason even today that the Yazidi and the Mandeans are considering, a threat that has to go. And I always think, well, maybe that's where the battle really is. It's going to be with the future meme magic or the Bind Trump or the forces that the Church of Satan is releasing. It's going to be a magical battle. What do you think about this theory I'm working on?
Well, it's interesting you bring this up because I've kind of immersed myself in Babylonian religion, and let me just say that, I use Babylonian religion as sort of a catch-all for Mesopotamian religion. I mean, it all sort of dates back to Sumer, and the lines of continuity are just astonishing. Their religion is really practiced in these shrines. They sort of had a very humanistic sense, and they would focus on a particular god and erect a shrine to them in their homes, and that sort of became much more the focus of their religion, because the temples are sort of these weird esoteric rites that they don't understand, and it's being spoken in a language that they don't speak, and it's just very alien to them. So religion became magic in a sense, and we see this. One of my favorite ancient texts is the Maklu, it's an Assyrian, it dates from the Assyrian era, but it's all about like, calling on particular gods to, curse the person who is cursing you. It's basically a text of a magical war. It's a magical battle. It's like something from the Golden Dawn, but just like hardcore. I believe that in that sense that, religion as it's understood is evolving towards magic. Neo-paganism is evolving towards magic. Even Wicca is evolving into a different kind of magical understanding. And I think that it's following a pattern here. And again, you talked about this with the Gnostics and how this sort of migrates from say the late Gnostic period into the early medieval period with the grimoires and sort of the Hermetic texts and things like that, sort of being between these two worlds, between the world of late antiquity and the early medieval and maybe even like high medieval period. So I think that's kind of inevitable. But there's just one major caveat that I have to throw in here, and it's kind of like, I understand this impetus towards magic, towards chaos magic, ceremonial magic, occult magic, and so on and so forth. And I see it as just part of the cycle that we're going through. But at the same time, the other thing that really characterized Babylonian religion were demons. That demons were seen to be so prevalent and so overpowering and so ever present in Babylonian society. I mean, this is even before like the Jewish captivity, which is really the birth of Judaism as it's understood. I mean, Judaism really grew out of the captivity, and so much of the Pentateuch is drawn from Babylonian myth and Babylonian sources. But even before that, I mean, you had this. I'm not seeing this through the lens of monotheism, sort of casting judgment on this. But I mean, this is like before that period, well before that period, that Babylon was kind of like, it was Carl Sagan's demon haunted world, so to speak. That demons were seen as such an overpowering force, and that you were more beholden to the power of these demons than you were to the gods themselves. The gods were sort of aloof; they were kind of disinterested, and you're sort of at the mercy of demons. And the interesting thing that arises out of this is the angels. That the angels become this sort of counterbalancing force to the power of these demons. And again, getting back to that whole idea with the Maklu of this magical war. I mean, it's really like you're calling on these kind of lesser gods. I mean, there are things, to the sun god and so on and so forth, but it's more towards like the fire gods, these sort of, second tier gods. You're calling on them to curse these people. I think that, that's where we start to see the rise of the angels, and the angels sort of rebuild that hierarchy. So it's almost like a cycle. And like I said, I do believe that everything we're experiencing now and everything that we're observing now is, remarkably temporary, that it's all going to coalesce into, I don't want to necessarily say a new monotheism or a world religion, but it's certainly going to coalesce into a paradigm that people are going to embrace, partly because of compulsion, but also because of, it's sort of a shelter towards this chaotic world of witches and demons that people, thousands of years before us had to contend with. And that's sort of where we see the rise of, of Zoroastrianism, this dualistic world. The demons are sort of all put in one camp, and these angels, these counterbalancing forces, are all sort of put in this other camp. I mean, let's not forget that, the angels as we understand them in Judaism and Christianity and Islam, are not really there in these earlier conceptions, these Babylonian captivity conceptions in the Bible. Angels are just sort of these guys that show up and say, do that, and then they become basic lesser gods. So they're actually no monotheism per se, because you have Catholicism, the saints, and even Judaism, particularly in Orthodoxy, you have the angels. So there are always these dissensional forces. But I believe that this period that you're talking about, and that we're seeing, unfold around us today with magic. Magic is a technology. I think for a lot of people, it's just sort of like a countercultural pose, and they don't really actually believe in it. And they don't really think it works, and they don't think it's real. I mean, I believe in magic. I think it's real. I think it works. I think that, calling on the spirits is usually like a really bad idea, because the spirits, I think, are inherently deceptive, and at best, indifferent. So I believe that this whole period that we're entering into now is probably going to, it's going to be the final blow. It's going to be the final straw that will sort of collapse this earlier consensus and lead to this new consensus that will arise partly out of necessity and partly by design.
Well, I think that's all the time we have today, Chris. I'd like to thank you very much for once again coming on Aeon Byte.
It's my great pleasure. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, Miguel. Always.
Always. The pleasure's all mine. Thanks for being here, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you.
And there you have it, the first part of our interview with Chris Knowles. It only gets more disturbing and amazing in our second part. Chris has made an incredible case in The Secret Sun on how the elite have used magic against us for millennia. The next question I ask him, and I did mention this in our introduction, is maybe it's time we, the people, used magic against them. His answer is stunning, and his advice is revelatory. We also continue discussing how these are indeed Gnostic times, and how this is truly an apocalypse. And Chris covers relevant themes today like transhumanism, transgenics, and more. He gets very passionate. And we find what gods are coming to assist the demiurge in our total enslavement. Not to be missed. Only $5.99 a month to join. Complete and not partial shows. Access to more than 375 episodes. Your private RSS feed where you can listen to all complete shows on the podcaster of your choice. Invitation to our Inner Sanctum of Gnosis Facebook group where we are building a community of mystics, madmen, and sages. And many past guests hang out there, and I'm always there to directly and personally answer your questions or issues. Same benefits if you become a patron at Patreon, except you get early shows. If anything, a few shekels here and there via PayPal or the US mail. Let's keep this red pill cafeteria open, and let's keep that content a-coming in these Gnostic times. I can't do it without you. Much appreciation for those of you who support on a weekly basis. Yes, it really is the apocalypse, but not as you think, not as you've been taught. Things are opening up above and below. So it's whether you'll be washed in light-filled enlightenment or swallowed by darkness. There is no middle ground except the average. And that's basically hell for all humans. And I hope you're tired of that after so many lifetimes. I hope you gain more tools to gain that enlightenment. You are the final authority and make the final decision. Nobody else. We fight the good fight, keep the faith, and we will finish the race. And I'll keep you company all the way as you keep me company. Hello and goodbye as always.